So good afternoon and welcome to this working group strategy webinar on the post-WSIS+20 context, challenges and opportunities for the IGF. Thank you all for joining us today. The working group on strategy has convened this webinar to take stock of the discussion held over the past year and also to reflect on the way forward in light of the WSIS+20 review outcomes. So, as you know, the IGF has reached a significant milestone with the confirmation of its permanent mandate within the UN system. And this represents both an important recognition of its value and also a call to further strengthen its role. At the same time, a new phase raises a number of important questions that will be shared later by our moderator, Henriette Serusen. But let me share a few information on the structure of this webinar. We are particularly pleased to have with us Dr. David Souter, who will open the discussion with this reflection. And then it will be followed by a distinguished group of speakers who have actively contributed to the working group strategy discussion over last year. We will have Anita, Gurumurthy, Executive Director for IT for Change, Theresa Swinehart from ICANN, Senior Vice President of Global Domain and Strategy, William Lee from Australia Government, Assistant Director at the Department of Infrastructure and Transport, Regional Development Communications. Then we have Lea Kaspar from NetMission, Youth Advocate in Internet Governance, and also Organizing Committee member of APAC. Chafic Chaya from Lebanon IGF, Regional Manager Public Policy and Government Affairs from RIPE NCC. Elonnai Hickok from Global Network Initiative, Managing Director of the GNI. And then we have Isabelle Lois, Vice Chair of UNCSTD and also Senior Policy Advisor at Ofcom, Switzerland. Then Desiree RIPE NCC and IGF 2025 member. Then Juan Fernandez from Cuba Government, WGIG members and IGF MAG 2025 member. Lea Kaspar, Executive Director at Global Partners Digital, and then Stanley Adamson from UK Government, Head of Global Internet Governance International Security Directorate. And then Jordan Carter will be presented, his reflection will be presented by our co-chair, Bruna Martin Los Santos. Then we will have Mona Gaballa from ISOC, Senior Advisor Institutional Relationship. And then there are the conclusion from Coral Roach, IGF MAG Chair, and also from Wolfgang, that is Professor Emeritus from University of Asia, and also IGF MAG member, and our MAG Chair, that is Undersecretary, Ministry of Grand Bahama. Then now let me give the floor to Henriette Serusen, Senior Advisor at PC and the former MAG Chair. Please, Henriette, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Titi. Thanks very much for joining us. We've got a good turnout. It was short notice, but this is also the closing, the final cycle of this MAG working group strategy. And therefore, we didn't want to delay too long. And also, we feel that it's important IGF to launch this new cycle, this post-WSIS permanent mandate, from a space of critical thinking and constructive and creative debate. And so many of you did put effort into thinking about the IGF. You've put it in writing, you've put it through your voices. And we felt it would be really powerful to close this cycle of the IGF MAG by acting and thinking forward. So to give us our opening remarks, I really feel quite honored to introduce a longtime colleague, David Souter, who has worked on governance and inclusive government participation prior to the WSIS, but also during and post the WSIS. But David has a particular position, I think, of insight into the WSIS, because he has worked through both the 2003 cycle, the 2000 cycle, and then in the course of the review processes, has been compiling some of the really milestone reports, and the 2015 10-year review for CSTD, and again the 20-year review. And he has worked quite closely with DESA in some of this work and with CSTD and others. But he also has his own independent perspective. So David, let me not say much more about you. You can add if I've not introduced you sufficiently, but please share with us what you think the critical points of engagement should be for the IGF community at this time.
So thanks very much, Henriette. You've asked me to talk for around 20 minutes. I've put together some thoughts around that. And thanks for that background introduction. Yes, I worked on both the 10 and 20-year reviews for CSTD. I also worked with DESA and the co-facilitators through the WSIS+20 process last year. And in terms of the IGF, I've been at almost every IGF. I was lead consultant for the expert group meeting in 2022. Most recently, for the UN, I've prepared a paper on the challenges and opportunities for IGF arising from WSIS+20 ahead of the expert group meeting that's scheduled for later this month. So I'll draw on that expertise, that experience over the next 20 minutes. But as you said, Henriette, these will be personal observations, and they come from my own perspective, which is really my interest is in the relationship between digitalization and other areas of public policy, so development, environment, international relations, and so on. And while I've always been involved in the forum, I'll aim, therefore, to see what I say here from an outside perspective as well as from someone who's been inside the process. So I think it's worth starting with some general points about WSIS+20 and the broader context that affects the IGF and other WSIS entities going forward. I think the first thing I'd say is that we need to recognize, I think, that we can be blindsided by the time we've spent ourselves on WSIS. I was lecturing recently in Oxford to students who are concerned with digital technology and also students with diplomas on diplomacy. And few of those in either group knew anything about WSIS or the IGF. And I find the same when I talk to people from businesses that rely on the internet but aren't part of it, or international organizations concerned with issues that are profoundly affected by the internet but aren't part of it. In other words, we're not as well known as we maybe would like to be. And the second thing is that I think we should recognize that WSIS+20 didn't change that much. What it did was largely reaffirm the principles and the frameworks that were adopted 20 years ago, with the addition of integrating GDC, at least in principle. And the resolution is largely rhetorical and aspirational, which is not a criticism. It reflects what was feasible. Underlying that, though, today's digital society is unrecognizable from that when WSIS was agreed. And the number and range of public policy issues affected by digitalization has grown enormously. The interfaces with other areas of public policy are much more important than they used to be. And I'd argue we're at a new inflection point in digital development, globalization of the internet back then, globalization of AI today. So while there's some, I think rightly, satisfaction at the agreement that was reached in the 20-year review, there were many issues that weren't discussed or weren't resolved there, and those won't go away. They're going to recur, they'll become more challenging. And I'm going to mention some of them because I think they fundamentally affect the strategic challenge for the IGF over the next few years. So the relationship between WSIS and the GDC will return in the GDC review next year. Integration was agreed in December, but not how it was going to work. Rapid technological change will require continuous rethinking about AI governance. The relationship between digital and sustainable development will be a major issue in the SDG review in 2030, and it will require much more serious thinking about financing mechanisms than took place last year. The belief among G77 governments that they're underrepresented in digital policy development and that their population's priorities are poorly served by it, that will continue to be pressing. There are crucial interfaces between digital development and other fields of public policy that weren't addressed enough in WSIS+20, like environmental impacts, or weren't touched on at all, like the militarization of technology. And the international rules-based order in which WSIS and the IGF are both embedded is under much greater pressure than it has been at any previous time in my lifetime, which is 70 years. So I think if you look at the General Assembly process, I call the process of text negotiation that we saw there competitive semantics. I think it's a real achievement that led to a resolution which held the line on existing international agreements. But the tensions underlying the negotiations were profound, and you can see that in the statements in the final General Assembly session. It'll be much harder to translate that resolution into practice in a context of geopolitical dysfunction. with shifting power asymmetries between governments and regions and businesses, and where there's real great uncertainty about the likely impact of new technologies. And I thought I ought to start with those general points because I do think they fundamentally affect the strategic challenges ahead. So we need to consider, it seems to me, how the IGF will work within those contexts of precarious international relations, evolving interaction between digital development and other areas of public policy, unpredictable technology and unpredictable impacts, and the concentration of digital decision-making power and resources which we see around us at the moment. The rest of what I'll say is more specific to the IGF, and again, it will be personal observations based on my experience and past involvement, though I'll draw on the comments that are included in the paper I recently prepared for DESA, as was mentioned. The most obvious outcome of the WSIS resolution for the IGF was, of course, to make it permanent within the UN system. And it also reiterated past resolutions which urged the forum to improve working modalities, to broaden participation, to reinforce intersessional work, to publish more substantive outcomes. And it called for the Secretariat to be strengthened, and it asked the Secretary General to come up with a new plan for funding. So all of those goals have been heard many times before in the last 20 years, in reviews of the forum by CSTD more than a decade ago, in the retreat DESA organized in 2016, which I took part in, the 2022 expert group meeting report, which I urge you to revisit. It's on the website, though quite hard to find, in the IGF itself, in this working group and elsewhere. And they keep recurring because they prove difficult to address, especially with limited resources. So I thought it might be useful if I said something about 6 particular things, and I'll try to provoke and stimulate discussion by what I say. And those 6 things are the IGF within the UN system, the range of issues it covers, participation and engagement, the ecosystem, the forum's outcomes, and its governance. So I'll start with the IGF within the UN system. And actually, when I reviewed the consultation inputs for the co-facilitators here, I was struck by how little discussion there was about what permanent status in the UN might entail in practice. So I think it's important first to recognize that the value of permanent status within the UN system depends substantially on the stature that the UN has in international relations, which is under great pressure at the moment. If we value being part of the UN system, we need to value the UN system itself. And I'd say that not least because I think multi-stakeholder engagement works within multilateral institutions in ways that simply aren't available in a world of great power rivalries, or a world in which international norms and agreements have a much diminished or much challenged role. And I think permanent status also has formal implications. So if you make something that was temporary permanent, I think that requires rethinking what it's for and how it works. I looked for an analogy, and I think if you want an analogy, consider marriage, which also makes something that was temporary into something that is permanent. It does require rethinking about what the relationship involved entails. In particular, I think permanent status in the UN system reinforces the need for the forum to be fully inclusive of all member states of the UN, including the governments of all member states, and to ensure that the diverse perspectives of all UN member states and all UN member governments are fully represented in it. So that said, it's also an obvious opportunity to assess the forum's strengths and weaknesses, to review role and potential, consider how it fits into the broader ecosystem of multilateral and multi-stakeholder bodies that are concerned with public policy, and by that, not just digital policy, but all kinds of public policy. And ideally, I would say, this would be informed by a comprehensive planned assessment of the IGF, what it's done, what it can do, an assessment that would take some time and commitment, and that would focus on addressing weaknesses and limitations rather than asserting its achievements. In particular, I think, an assessment that asks those outside the IGF community what they know about it, what they think of it, how they think it could be useful to them. I ask the question, therefore, how far do policymakers concerned with issues that concern us currently engage with the IGF? Are they at the forum? Do they contribute to its work? Do they read its outputs? Do they find them useful? So we know the answer to that with for example, people in this meeting are concerned, where ICANN is concerned, or ISOC, they're very engaged. But what about others? So how much impact does the forum have on thinking in the current US administration, or the governments of India or China? How much is it listened to in the World Bank, or in the UN Environment Programme, or the IPCC, or the World Trade Organization, or ASEAN, or the OECD? Is it heard in the boardrooms of NVIDIA, or Amazon, or Alibaba, or even more so OpenAI, or Palantir, or in the international business sectors that are on the demand side of digital development, such as international finance? So I think it's really important to ask those questions about how the IGF is perceived externally in order to address its strategic development. So some thoughts on the other points that I've mentioned. I think there's always been a fundamental tension in the forum. Is its goal to facilitate discussion between all viewpoints? So to be a universal forum like the General Assembly is? Or does it have an ethos, a vision like the internet we want, that presents a more like-minded but less universal view? And I think the permanence within the UN system makes that tension, which is about representing and reflecting all perspectives, more acute. I think the demand for more substantive outcomes that I'll come back to is made more challenging by permanence. What about the range of issues covered? So I can remember discussion after WSIS and before the first IGF about whether it should consider a wide range of subjects or focus each year on a single issue, such as spam. And it chose the former approach, and that remains the case. There's been talk in recent years on two sides of this question, I think. There's been talk about how it might become an overarching digital policy forum rather than one that's focused on the internet per se. But at the same time, there have been discussions, suggestions that it should concentrate its focus more narrowly, looking at specific themes in greater depth, perhaps with multi-annual programming across the whole ecosystem. So there are limits to what any forum can achieve. If you have a broad range of subjects, it will tend to deal in generalities rather than detail. If you have a narrower focus, it can make more substantive outcomes on fewer issues. So which of those would be more useful? It's difficult to do both. On participation, excuse me a second while I drink. So I've always felt, and I've worked on this many years ago with APC and ISOC in the early days after WSIS, I've always felt the stakeholder categories in WSIS are too simplistic because they don't recognize the diversity within stakeholder groups. For example, if we just count the number of governments involved, we're not measuring whether development ministries take part as well as those concerned with digital policy. Or if we just count the number of businesses, we don't reflect on the need for participation from the demand side, from businesses that use the internet, as well as the supply side of businesses that make it. But more than this, I'd say the internet today affects every aspect of human society. So how might that be progressed? I think if it wants to influence public policy issues beyond the internet itself, so sustainable development, environment, employment, social welfare, and so on, I think the IGF needs to interact much more proactively with decision makers and communities of practice in those public policy areas, which I think requires a much more equal dialogue. So a dialogue that acknowledges the very different paradigms and different priorities that those working in those policy arenas have, sets out to understand them, explores the interfaces with them on a more equal and more balanced basis than has been possible so far. I'd see the IGF in that context as an opportunity for the internet community to learn from those other policy dimensions and communities of practice. So to learn about their policy agendas, how those policy agendas are being affected by the internet, and what would be most valuable to them, rather than thinking of that from inside the digital environment ourselves. One of the most contentious issues around participation in WSIS+20 was to do with the role of governments within the forum, especially what some were calling a governmental track, but which might have been considered not unlike the GAC in ICANN. Now, I personally think it's important in any policy arena for those with common interests to explore ideas within as well as between stakeholder communities. It's part of how new ideas emerge, how consensus evolves, how norms become established in every other policy arena that I know of. And I thought the discussion about this in New York was unnecessarily bruising. I think the text that was eventually agreed was another exhortation to strengthen the participation of governments and other stakeholders from developing countries, but it masked a much more polarized debate. So it seems to me that full participation of developing country governments in the forum is crucial to its credibility as a permanent UN institution, going back to what I said about the UN earlier. And the way the IGF responds to that paragraph in the resolution is going to be important. How does it incentivize participation by developing countries and engage more effectively with their concerns? How does it ensure it has sufficient value to them to make their fuller participation on their part worthwhile? And the forum will lose out if that is not addressed substantively. It's an issue that is, it seems to me, decidedly ongoing, moving forward from the negotiation. So I'm coming to the latter points that I thought I'd make. The evolution into an ecosystem of the forum with intersessional activities and NRIs, that's rightly welcomed in the WSIS resolution. It's an evolution that's been organic rather than planned, and that has, I think, advantages and disadvantages. The question now, I think, is how that ecosystem might achieve more substance and significance. Now, when intersessional activities and NRIs have been talked of as IGF achievements, they've been mostly simply quantified. So many dynamic coalitions, for instance, so many NRIs. What actually matters is what they do, how representative they are, how inclusive, how authoritative, how substantive are their outcomes, how influential. So take the NRIs. They differ substantially from one another, which is a good thing, not a bad thing. Mine in the UK, I think, is a good discussion forum. It's a space in which we learn and talk, rather than a space from which we influence. Some NRIs have a great deal more impact than others. Some are successful, but we need to recognize that some are not. And some that we currently count appear to be inactive. NRIs and intersessional activities are such important parts of the ecosystem now that I think the forum would greatly benefit from a thorough and comprehensive review, or two reviews really, of their experience in order to identify lessons learned and opportunities for further development, including their sustainability. So to make them better, more influential, more useful to those inside the IGF community, and more relevant to those outside it, I'd say we need to understand how representative they are and how to make them more inclusive, what's been successful and what's not in their organization, in their communications, their outreach, where they've had influence or impact and what's brought that about, and also where they haven't. And as with the IGF generally, I think we need to ask those questions of those we're seeking to influence, not just of the inside IGF community. Which brings me to outcomes. So I've always felt the forum's greatest value is as what can be called a probalutic forum, or sometimes called a talking shop. A place, in other words, where issues are discussed without decisions being made, which improves the way decisions are then made elsewhere. I think that adds value in that particular role, a probalutic role. The WSIS resolution calls, like many previous resolutions, for more substantive outcomes that can achieve greater impact. So I would say that requires a deliberative process. And I think the forum struggled with how to achieve that really since its early years. You can see the challenge with the annual messages. These rely on session organizers submitting summaries of their sessions at the annual meeting, and then someone editing those overnight to select what feels like a consensus before the meeting heads for home. And there's then a request for comments, which elicits very few responses. So I've done this job myself a couple of times. It can be done. The messages are useful. It can be done well, and the messages can be really useful. But it's not a deliberative process that would stand up to scrutiny if it's questioned in an international negotiation. How can more substantive outputs be developed without shifting from a discussion forum to something that's too rigid or too disputatious and that undermines the basic approach the IGF has had? And there's another issue here that I think applies to all outcome documents, including those from NRIs and intersessional activities, which is this. The target audience is decision makers in governments and international agencies, in businesses, in civil society, in the technical community, and elsewhere. These are people who have access to a huge range of substantive, authoritative material on the issues that the IGF is concerned with, from UN and other international agencies, from research bodies, consultancies, universities, businesses, experts with different views on different issues, and of course from highly funded lobbyists. It's a really competitive marketplace for ideas and influence. And to stand out in it, IGF inputs have to be really good. They have to be well researched and well written, substantive, authoritative. They have to say something that is credible and something that's distinctive. Publishing outcomes alone, in other words, isn't sufficient. Those outcomes have to address target audiences' needs and to reach them in ways that they'll find relevant and valuable. And that's a really big ask for groups of volunteers. Because as well as equitable representation and diversity, it requires project management and quality control and peer review and a communications strategy. So how might that be developed? And lastly, a few words on governance. Tunis agenda, going back to that. It said the forum should have a lightweight and decentralized structure with minimal financial implications. And this was before anyone had much idea how it would be constituted in the first place. So the institutional structure of the forum, basically the Secretariat and the MAG, that's not changed significantly since WSIS other than by adding the leadership panel. So think back those 20 years. It was established when the internet for most people was an aspiration rather than reality, when it affected most public policy arenas tangentially rather than centrally, before the emergence of the platform economy, the social media we know today, big data, AI, the range of organizations that is really important in the internet world. Nowadays, the range of discussion fora that there is today, and before the evolution of the IGF itself from an annual meeting into a much more complex ecosystem. Governance frameworks normally evolve to meet the changing circumstances of the organizations that they govern, and those are very changed circumstances. Go back to the Tunis agenda. It's the structure of the forum should be subject to periodic review. That's my quote, subject to periodic review. Transition to permanent status would seem the obvious time for such a kind of review. Consider what's working well, what needs changing in the light of today's circumstances, new responsibilities, what's needed to fulfill future ambitions of the next IGF generation, if you like. And I'll leave that at that with you like that. So I think I've come to the end of my 20 minutes. So I was asked to give some reflections on the strategic development of the IGF, and I've tried to do it in a way that would, I think, stimulate or provoke discussion. I think the transition to permanent status is an opportunity to revitalize the forum in what is a very challenging and rapidly changing digital and public policy environment. So if I sum it up in one sentence, I'm saying permanence is not a solution, it's an opportunity. And how effectively the forum responds to that opportunity is going to be a test of the WSIS+20 resolution's outcome as a whole. So I hope that's useful. And back to you, Henriette.
And thanks very much, David. And yeah, my thumbs up is the sign that your time's up, and you were just perfectly on time. In fact, it's also, I think, useful for us to hear from you that you raise many of the issues that working group strategy has been talking about. So I think it's also an affirmation of the fact that MAG members and MAG working group strategy members have already started to engage some of these challenges. Now let's hear from people that have been thinking about this. And I first will give the floor. I had Anita on the speaker list, but Theresa Swinehart from ICANN needs to go somewhere. And Theresa, your 3 minutes starts now.
Well, thank you, Henriette. I actually need to drop at the top of the hour, but I shall take this opportunity just very quickly. So, David, your remarks really cover a breadth of issues, and I think you're absolutely spot on with regards to the permanence is an opportunity, but we have work to do. That the IGF is anchored in the global internet ecosystem, and we now have that in place is really our opportunity to support its evolution in that context. But the status quo is not what the evolution needs to be. It's an opportunity. I know that last year we had put out some thoughts with regards to some key practical elements around an IGF, and I think we still need to be focusing in those with regards to logistical stability, administrative stability, financial stability. When it comes to the scope and focus and the benefits of all participants, these are also some very practical things that we need to be taking a look at. And how does this play a role in the strategic development, but stay current also with issues that are important from a societal or economic standpoint to all stakeholders and to all regions? And in this, just some suggestions that one might want to consider. As we look at an IGF and what the themes are, and David had touched on, is it all-encompassing themes, or is it a narrow theme such as spam, or is it a narrow theme such as a societal or economic issue that is relevant to a broad range of stakeholders? One thing that we might want to consider is, what is a topic that is relevant for a government business for all sectors from a societal or economic standpoint that contributes towards achieving elements of the WSIS+20 outcomes, namely for inclusivity and providing the ability for all to engage. And so one thought might be that one looks at an IGF that takes on a thematic issue, by example, let's say education. What kind of business sectors are providing services in educational arenas? What are some of the challenges with regards to ensuring that it doesn't harm the internet, but rather it retains a seamless, unfragmented internet? What are some data privacy issues that are arising with regards to providing education online or providing education to all sectors of society, all age groups from K to 5 in high school and universities? What data privacy examples might there be? What spam issues, what security or abuse? Even how does one ensure that there's multilingual content, and how does one make that accessible and generate that? Not just for universities, but by example, for high schools, create awareness, that's an ability. So that's one thought that one might take. One could also look at banking or healthcare. Bring together other sectors that may not be aware that having an IGF can contribute towards awareness around the policies that are relevant for specifically their areas and to benefit from that. That may be a way to broaden the sectors of participating and the interested businesses and governments and make that relevant. It may also be an opportunity for the NRIs at the national level to also be contributing towards some of those dialogues, but be seen as forums that could be a resource to help inform those dialogues and reach really the unreached government and businesses, but from also the emerging economies. So that is just some food for thought on how one might want to take a look at future IGF agendas, or maybe part of an IGF agenda. So one has general themes and then one has 50% or 40% dedicated to a very specific substantive area for that to bring new players. Briefly touching on the role of the IGF.
Theresa, your time's more or less up, but just finish very quickly.
Sorry, I shall finish very quickly. Sorry about that. With regards to the IGF, I think the IGF can be a contribution to the UN system and help also be a forum that provides information of what else is happening in other UN forums on specific issues of interest. So thank you very much. My apologies for the 3 minutes over, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Theresa. And I'm dying to comment, but I won't. Anita, you are next.
Thanks so much. Quite thought-provoking to listen to David's thoughtful comments. I think the strength of the IGF is very well known, is that it's a kind of a political arena. So in the arena, you can actually voice the kind of standpoints that come out of your constituency's interests. What is important to remember is that whether it's a permanent or not permanent entity, now, of course, there is a mandate for it to be permanent, the IGF operates within the bounds of the Tunis agenda. So its efficacy lies in its ability to produce pathways for policy responsiveness. So that boundary condition, I think, is really important. And there is a need for the IGF to continue to flag new public policy issues in an agile manner and also taking note of the wonderful non-paper from Switzerland. I think the agenda setting role will remain very important, which really means that you have to have, as the IGF, the collective community called the IGF has to anticipate what is next on the arc of change in a rapidly moving baseline. I do think that in the spirit of democracy, and as David also noted, making space for different constituencies to dialogue among themselves and across constituencies will be really important. And in that regard, the WSIS+20 outcome in para 99, that it be made permanent, is really a welcome news. And in a world where space for democratic dialogue is shrinking, we should really look at this as a vital space we managed to save, especially for agendas that are yet to be set in terms of the ambition that David mentioned would be important for future generations. I think the context of para 101, which is really important in order to, this is from WSIS+20, which corresponds to para 6 of the Geneva Principle of broadening the participation of governments and other stakeholders from developing countries and underrepresented communities, is really important to call out. And I think that is important to remember when we think about the architecture in a futuristic way. Of course, there is a kind of an ambiguity around enhanced cooperation, but I do think that for all the various reasons that David called out, from thinking about AI, the question of digitalization and sustainability, the question of financing, a rules-based international order, and the whole system, multilateral system, being under enormous pressure, I think the IGF really needs to make way for a separate conversation on why incursions of a single state into the larger rule-based order can really be dealt with and how it needs to be dealt with. And I think that is really the meaning of sovereign equality, the equality of the participation of all countries in any particular domain. I would also like to draw attention to the report, High-Level Panel on Digital Corporations Report, Age of Digital Interdependence, and the reference to the idea of a policy incubator. So the idea of a policy incubator is excellent. Amrita is here, and she's been part of the policy deliberations on AI, for instance. And I think that initiative, if it is really defined for a family of initiatives, that would really be very useful.
Sorry to interrupt, but just time to get you a close.
Right. Yes, thank you very much. So what I really wanted to say is that we do need to retain the space of dialogue, create a virtuous cycle between dialogue and policy relevance. And that virtuous cycle depends on a certain set of conditions and maintaining momentum in the discussions. Today, we have the technology to really feed into different policy tracks through tagging decentralized session reports. So in any session report that we write for the IGF, it's possible to identify policy tracks, which then makes for an aggregation of political perspectives. I would think, finally, that it is in the aggregation of public interest issues that the relevance of the IGF lies. And that is what will lead to credibility and public interest. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Anita. And I'm sorry I have to rush us, but I'm hoping we'll have discussion at the end. And now let's hear from William Lee from the Government of Australia, also been thinking through this substantially and was part of the negotiation process. William, your reactions and responses.
Thanks very much, Henriette, and thank you to the Working Group Strategy, and in particular to work and insights that David has shared today and throughout the WSIS+20 process. He was a really important part of the process going forward. I think reflecting on some of the other speakers, I think there was a recognition that we have the canvas, we have the paints, we have the outline and the sketch, but what we need to do now is really colour in that picture really quickly in terms of what that permanency looks like and what the value of the IGF as an institution will be going forward. I think we've got a really narrow window, as David mentioned before, the Global Digital Compact Review next year, to show what this IGF can do within that new landscape that we're facing. And I think really what we saw through the process last year was that IGF reform by necessity in some respects, but also as an opportunity, needs to be a bottom-up process. And that's going to be hard, but I think it's something that this community is empowered to do. A couple of points. One, as we've heard around the question of funding. Funding is essential to everything that we do. And as we stand at the moment, the IGF continues to be funded through voluntary contributions. And so it needs to continue to generate value above and beyond what might be expected of other UN processes. And while the WSIS+20 outcome laid the hooks and laid the foundations for funding changes over time, really, as we stand today, it's about the community continuing to find ways to support the IGF from a financial perspective, because that really unlocks a lot of what we're trying to do. Second, I think governments are resource constrained, trying to navigate the digital ecosystem just as much as we all are. So this is really, for me, the underlying opportunity. Having a more targeted focus is one way to do that. Having improved participation will be important as well, but we can't just simply stare at that problem. We need to set out plans, strategies to improve that, targets, goals, expectations. I think having some really practical tools, we saw, for example, ideas around an IGF observatory or an IGF help desk to help governments and other stakeholders coming into this space for the first time navigate it would be really important. And then just to conclude, I think we have all of the components. We have NRIs, we have strong participation, we have intersessional work, we have permanency, and we have a secretariat. And it's now about putting all of those components together in a way that makes sense. And I think that's going to require some really structured plans and conversations over the next 12 months, because if we don't, then the important groundwork, the important institutional frameworks that we agreed at WSIS+20 may not be around for the 10 years that we envisioned. I'll pause there. Thanks very much, Henriette.
Thanks a lot, William. Next, we have Bea from NetMission from the Asia Pacific Youth Structures, but she's in transit and I don't think she's been able to join. Chafic, let's go over to you and let's hear from an NRI.
Thank you so much, and for the working group strategy efforts. And thank you, David, for your reflections and remarks. When it comes to a stronger participation by developing countries' government, it's not a matter of representation. It's also a matter of capacity building, financial support, and trusted engagement. From my experience during the WSIS+20 process, and as a member of the Lebanese national delegation, and coming from a developing country and sitting at the Lebanon IGF MAG, one lesson is very clear, that the multi-stakeholder collaboration is still working. However, as you all know, in today's geopolitical context, marked by fragmentation, governance models, a growing emphasis on sovereignty, multi-stakeholder and cooperation do not happen automatically. For example, from our experience from this region in the Middle East, we have seen encouraging progress with the acceptance of multi-stakeholder approach alongside the multilateral process. And this progress didn't happen by chance, didn't come from vacuum. It was helped by the excellent work from different stakeholders, especially from technical community, opening doors through capacity building, practical cooperation, and especially sustained engagement with national authorities to build a trust. And I think this is a very important lesson for the IGF. I would add one practical point here, that we should encourage the governments to include expertise from the different stakeholder groups within their national delegations. And this is really very important. I can't tell you how valuable was the 3 Lebanon IGF MAG members were in supporting Lebanon positive involvement in WSIS+20. Now, regarding the IGF ecosystem and the link between the annual meeting, NRIs, and the intersessional activities, I believe here that the IGF ecosystem needs better integration and not more layers. What I mean here, that the annual meeting, NRIs, and the intersessional activities should operate less as parallel tracks and more as one connected system. And here I stress from the Lebanon IGF and from the from the impact, from the positive impact of Lebanon IGF on the NRIs are not to be considered as side activity. I would also strongly support giving capacity building a more visible and structured place in the IGF, just as we are doing with the parliamentary track. To conclude, I will conclude with the same words I shared during the IGF strategy webinar last August, as I still believe it reflects what the IGF should strive for. I said that the IGF should be globally anchored, locally connected, technically resilient, with impactful outcome, but most importantly, to avoid becoming a negotiating forum. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chafic. Again, I'm going to have to not say anything, but I have some very interesting thoughts on this. So I think you are all making really relevant points. And next we have Elonnai Hickok from Global Network Initiative. Elonnai, your 3 minutes starts now.
Yeah, thanks so much, Henriette, and thank you to the other speakers for your thoughtful intervention, and to David for helping to set the scene for your remarks. I think I wanted to focus, one, on the importance of using the IGF as a space for coordination. As David pointed out, there are a number of different digital policy processes, forums taking place globally, but also within the UN. In particular, there's WSIS, there's the UN Global Dialogue, and the IGF, and it will be really important that these spaces coordinate and speak to each other, that there is cross-pollination of conversation where possible. And in particular, I think it's possible to do this around themes. So like different themes that are discussed in the UN Global Dialogue could also be carried forward and discussed with the IGF. Portions of WSIS can be discussed at WSIS, but also discussed at the IGF, etc. Commitments, so different commitments that are emerging out of these forums to try to coordinate those, and then outcomes. In particular, for example, with WSIS, I think IGF could be a really interesting space to have conversations around progress on the WSIS action line. I also think the WSIS+20 outcome document has just so many different outcomes and goals, themes, etc., that can be taken forward and discussed at the IGF. And in that, I think it's important to have that coordination happening at the level of the NRIs, the regional level, and the intersessional work. And so you're strengthening the whole ecosystem within the IGF, and then you're coordinating it across different policy processes around digital that are emerging within the UN. I think on the governmental track, it will be really important that this is a very inclusive format structure that is created and speaks to some of the concerns that were voiced during the WSIS+20 process by developing countries about inclusion, about equal participation. The governmental track is a space to address that. And so as that's getting developed, I think having that center of mind and a clear objective will be important. I think overall, the IGF is really well placed to provide multi-stakeholder input and be just the best practice for a multi-stakeholder process. And David, maybe to your question about how can we catch the attention of these large companies like OpenAI for the IGF, I think two things. One, definitely being action-oriented, having strong policy discussions will be important, having the format be very interactive, having clear outcomes, but also just having a very strong multi-stakeholder process where companies and other stakeholders know that they can come to the IGF and they're getting inputs that are flowing from the national level, the NRI, to the regional level, to the global level. And I actually don't think that bottom up, that grassroots of a process exists in other spaces and forums. And so it's really important to strengthen it and emphasize it, and it be clear that that is where the IGF is, where you get these multi-stakeholder perspectives. So I have a lot of different thoughts, but I think I wanted to focus on those three things: the importance of coordination within the UN and having that flow through NRI, regional to global, the importance of the governmental track being used to address questions around equal participation, and the importance of strengthening, maintaining, and emphasizing the multi-stakeholder process of the IGF. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Elonnai, and to everyone for trying to be brief. Next, we'll hear from Isabelle Lois from Switzerland. Isabelle.
Thank you, and I hope everyone can hear me well. Hi, everyone. I'm Isabelle. I wanted to say first that I concur with most of what the previous speakers have said, and I think it really shows the enthusiasm to now have the IGF be permanent. It shows that it has been recognized and that there's a trust in the multi-stakeholder model, that this is something that really works and brings an added value to the whole UN system. So I think this is something we should focus on and see it as a win. Of course, there's a lot of things we can now do with it, and I think making the IGF permanent gives it a stronger institutional capacity. We hope for more predictable funding, maybe reinforcement of the Secretariat. I think it gives the impetus of showing now we can move forward. I did want to maybe bring a few points on following the WSIS+20 outcome document, because I think it does highlight a few of the points that IGF should work on to become better and really deliver on its demands. And I think one of the points is to maybe prioritize on the themes that WSIS+20 addressed. There's a lot of different points that remain unsolved. Digital divides and all of the other points that are raised in the document really require a lot of profound work. And I think this is where the IGF is the place to start and continue those conversations. I think someone mentioned the non-paper that we have recently shared with many of you. If someone wants it, I'm happy to send it to them, where we discuss and highlight the role that the IGF plays in this ecosystem, which is the trendsetter, the agenda setter, really showing where is the discussion going, what should we focus on, what are the concerns of the community. And I think this is really the main point and the main highlight that the IGF brings, and this is what its added value is. On the government dialogue, and I do want to say dialogue because specifically the wording that was chosen in the outcome document is quite important. It's not a track, it's not supposed to be a track, but it's a dialogue that includes as well all stakeholders. So it's not just for governments. I think this is something that shows an opportunity on how to bring also more participation for developing country governments. It's a need that has been identified, I think, already before we started discussing it in the WSIS+20 review, but a need to have a specific role for some governments that don't know how to engage with the IGF. And I do recognize that those who have been within the IGF space think it's easily to come into it and know how to navigate it. But if you're a country where maybe the delegates are changing constantly or with limited funding, then engaging with the IGF is not not as simple and not as easy. So I think this is something where we really can focus on bringing governments and having a specific role for them. So that's something that we should see as a good opportunity to create the space for dialogue, which is one of the main points of the IGF, and deliver in a good way. Maybe just last point, I wanted to highlight what Elonnai just mentioned on the coordination with the rest of the UN. I think this is something that IGF also could work on a bit. The messages be a bit more direct, maybe highlighting how they fit with the action lines, and then flow into the work of UNGIS and the CSTD. And I'll stop here, and I hope I didn't exceed too much. Thank you all.
You did not, Isa. Thanks very much for that. Next, we'll hear from Desiree Milosevic-Evans, also one of the current MAG members. I'm very pleased to see that we have lots of current sitting MAG members participating today. Desiree, you're free.
Thank you very much, Henriette, and everyone for organizing this webinar and giving me the floor. So I also concur with others that David has raised, and a lot of good points, almost all of them. And I will just focus maybe on 3 points. And one is what are the implications of permanent status in the UN system for the IGF, and what practical changes and it may require. So I agree that it's good news, and thank you WSIS and all stakeholders for making it happen. I think it's a strong political signal, and it confirms that the IGF is now an essential component of global digital governance. But it is also a new phase, and this is where I agree with David, and there should be an outside assessment. And although there is no precedent in the UN system for what we are doing, a multi-stakeholder, non-negotiating process becoming permanent is all important to maintain. So the real work should start now. And so it does bring, I would say, recognition, but also huge expectations. And others have spoken about it. And I think the IGF cannot just remain only a convening space. I like the points Elonnai mentioned about it being a coordinating space. Also thank the Swiss government for trying to portray this very complex picture of 39 UNGIS agencies and how it interacts with WSIS and GDC. But really what the Secretariat would need some enhanced capacities, not to negotiate, but to synthesize and to connect and to have a more predictable and diversified funding that was mentioned by Theresa and others. And also what is really important is the shift to a multi-year planning, multi-year strategic planning, where the MAG could help with its strategic planning group. But at the same time, we should avoid this fundamental misunderstanding that the IGF lies in what it is not, that it's not a negotiating body and it's not a treaty organization and not an intergovernmental forum. We need to maintain its role as a neutral, inclusive interface in this increasingly fragmented space. So the risks, yes, are clear, perhaps a small drift towards intergovernmental dominance and over bureaucratization. So the challenge itself is not permanence, but preserving the IGF's unique multi-stakeholder DNA while allowing it to evolve and to mature. So yes, if I may continue still, if I have time, however.
You need to finish, but you can finish your last thought.
Okay, we do not, maybe to reflect on one more point on producing influential outcomes, I think we do not suffer from shortage of reports, but really to remain relevant, we should not compete on this volume, but aligning it with other decision-making moments, the G20 regional processes, and continue to act as a translation layer across fragmented policy silos. Impact will come from delivering the right message and the right time to the right actors. And finally, maybe one final thought on the governance itself. I think the inclusiveness we have is not enough. We need a stronger strategic role for the MAG with focused lesson process and more on direction and clear leadership structure, which will continue beyond the annual cycles. And with that, I think most importantly, the leadership panel should, if we have one again, should reflect the full diversity of the multi-stakeholder model. In this context, the technical community should have a more prominent and visible role, not because of its expertise, but because it brings operational credibility and a long-standing culture of bottom-up coordination, which is essential for the IGS future. So
thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
I think we need to, sorry to cut you off. I know it's horrible. But thanks a lot for that. Juan Fernandez, Juan, your 3 minutes starts now.
So thank you for convening this webinar, and also thank you, David, for his remarks. I think he covered all the topics that you placed in the guiding questions. I want to refer to the guiding question 4, that is the outreach of the IGF to the outside world. Because here, I think there's some in attendance that maybe are not members of the MAG. You know that in the MAG, we were doing a process of trying to improve the IGF to the inside. And I think that's good because everything can be improved. But the IGF, as it is, it's pretty good. That's how it has received all the support in the WSIS+20 and elsewhere. So I think that we should continue trying to improve to the inside. But that is not the essential thing, because the IGF has proven to be a unique forum within the international organization in the world. Yesterday, I shared a document that I drafted last year about the uniqueness of the IGF. I'm not going to go into depth into that. So I think that uniqueness of the IGF, I think it's the value, the selling value of the IGF to the rest of the world. That's why the outreach question in point 4. So I think that in that basis, we have to outreach to the rest of the organization, not only the ones at the WSIS framework. I think there was a very also shared document. What? Hello?
Go ahead. The audio did stop for a minute, but please go ahead.
Okay, so no, just what I said, that the outreach, in my opinion, is one of the most important things that we need to do. because if the rest of the organization, not only within the WSIS framework, but also the rest of the organization that has to deal with digital policy in the world, does not recognize or does not know the value that the IGF can bring to their processes, I think that the battle will be lost. And in that sense, I think every one of us recognize that. But what I propose, and I proposed in a meeting some time ago, is that maybe the new MAG should do some concrete proposal of the formal linkage to the rest of the organizations, also to the business organizations and civil society organizations, but also the UN organization and the rest of the international organizations that have to do with it. Just to put an example, cybersecurity was discussed in an open-ended working group for many years in the General Assembly, the Commission of the General Assembly, the Second Commission. And in the IGF, there was a very good best practice forum on cybersecurity with very good document. And it was totally ignored. I think the same happens with the policy network or the artificial intelligence or the IGF, that it's very relevant and it's totally being ignored. I think we have to do concrete proposals on how to insert and that the rest of the organization recognize the uniqueness of the IGF and have and use the result of the IGF in their organization. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Juan. I'm not sure if you managed to finish. My connection is also not good. But in any case, your time is up. And thanks for being such a consistent thinker about strengthening the IGF. Next, we have Lea Kaspar.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute. Thanks for convening this session. In my intervention, I want to focus on 3 interlinked points that cut across some of the questions that you were posing and across some of the intervention that David made at the beginning. So I'm going to be talking about the IGF scope, its impact, and its own ecosystem. First, on scope view, I don't think that the IGF needs to choose between breadth and focus necessarily, but it does need to become more intentional in how it structures the thematic coherence. The key challenge today is not really the lack of themes, but the fragmentation across them, and something that we've highlighted in our answer to the call for thematic inputs. The priority should be cross-domain integration. That means linking AI, cybersecurity, data governance, civic space, various issues, rather than these siloed discussions. So rather than narrowing topics, I think that the IGF is in a great place to focus on more coherent and outcome-oriented tracks with creating deliberate bridges between them, if you will. Then on my second point I want to talk about is on impact and relevance of the forum. Now, I think David mentioned this, that we have a crowded landscape. The IGF's value is not really in producing any more reports, but in my view, in supporting delivery. The IGF is really uniquely positioned to enable implementation-oriented stock taking, to do evidence sharing on what works and what doesn't, on linking global commitments and, like in WSIS, the Global Digital Compact, and practice. With now having been granted permanent status, the question is not whether it should evolve, but how that should happen. I think we have the great opportunity not to formalize it into a traditional intergovernmental body, not that's the intention here, but which would undermine its core strengths, but to strengthen feedback loops between IGF outputs and various UN decision-making processes that are out there. In other words, it's how we make it more consequential without making it too bureaucratic, if you will. And then finally, on the IGF ecosystem itself, I wanted to make a point about that. Over the years, like the IGF has built a really strong architecture with its annual meeting, NRIs, intersessional work, but these elements are not sufficiently connected, I feel, and that's something that Elonnai was talking about as well. There is this need for clearer pathways between them, including stronger links between intersessional outputs and the annual meeting, as well as the kind of work and themes that are being discussed at national and regional level and the global IGF. And that more systematic integration of national and regional IGF processes into global discussions is really what I think we should be thinking about more intentionally. And I think this is essential to move from a set of activities to a coherent system with cumulative impact. So just in closing, how do I put it? The IGF should be defined not by what it discusses, but what it enables. And I think here we're thinking about how it enables implementation, how it enables participation, and how it enables system coherence. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Next, we have Craig Stanley Adamson from the UK government webinars last year. Craig, your reactions.
Thank you very much, Henriette. Thank you also to the chairs of the working group strategy for hosting this and for inviting me to speak. What can I say after so many fantastic speakers before me? So much great stuff has already been covered, but I might delve into a couple of bits a little bit further. First, just on the back of what David said from his really great introduction, it's really important to note that the WSIS+20 outcome did exceed many of our expectations, and with that comes the permanency of the IGF. It was also crucially important that WSIS+20 reaffirmed that the IGF is the primary multi-stakeholder platform for discussion of internet governance and other emerging issues. And then to me, this means that the IGF now has the opportunity to take up a leading role within the UN family, working alongside organizations such as the ITU, UNESCO, UNCTAD, etc. This is a moment to really take this opportunity. And I think for me as well, in my limited experience of the IGF over the last couple of years, but it's enriched by its participation. And I think we really agree and support the need to broaden this participation, particularly amongst governments and stakeholders from developing countries. I will touch upon and also thank Isabelle and Henriette in the chat as well with relation to paragraph 101 on talking about including that participation. Just know that we didn't obviously agree on a government track, as Isabelle said. This is a dialogue essentially between government with the participation of all stakeholders. We should not depart from that. I know there's different ideas about how that could look, but just really want to make sure that this is a space that we uphold what was agreed in WSIS+20, that this is a multi-stakeholder forum. Internet governance continues to be multi-stakeholder. We don't want to end up in silos that maybe we see in the ITU. I know there was a reference mentioned to a GAC-like format. I will say, as the UK GAC member at ICANN, it's a great forum. We do spend a lot of time in one room and don't necessarily get to go out of the room or have the opportunity to go out of the room and engage in some of the other conversations that are going on between stakeholders elsewhere. So just making sure that we use maybe that space that this dialogue will create. That will be determined by what is agreed or discussed within the MAG and UN DSIT, but it should be a space with a format that ensures that governments can have focused dialogue with the inputs from stakeholders to help shape those future discussions. So David mentioned the huge array of different stakeholder groups within the traditional stakeholder groups, and maybe it's an opportunity for actually leaders from those different groups sitting in a room with governments, as Isabelle said, who are not maybe so familiar, but it's a help to maybe we can get everyone up to speed, we can get everyone having conversations. It's not easy to get across the complete breadth of the IGF, and maybe using this dedicated space for some of those focused discussions on an equal footing is useful. There's also an encouraging wider participation and stronger impact of the IGF. There is a need for the IGF to perhaps develop stronger, clearer, more actionable outcomes. I will stress these are not decisions, not recommendations, with clearer links between the IGF workshops, the overarching messages, and of course, this is also good. This could also feed into the reporting that the IGF will do to the CSTD. And as David said as well, that broader dissemination amongst other agencies, other multilateral groups, other community groups, where maybe they don't hear about the great work of the IGF. I'll just respond also to some of the bits that Will mentioned on funding model for the IGF. Now, we are very much aware that with permanency comes new structures and increased size of the secretariat, etc. But also we shouldn't forget the success that the voluntary contributions model has brought to the IGF over the years. Now, this permanency has come at a maybe slightly unfortunate time with the UN tightening its purse strings. We don't know what the future funding might look like going forward. So making sure that we really don't forget some of the contributions that have come before, but also that renewed focus on the private sector and where we can potentially get more engagement, more contribution from them as well. And hopefully with increased participation from governments, that will all come hand in hand. Obviously, there's a lot more I could say as well about the continuation of the leadership panel, which we of course support, but also just as the recognition of NRIs and the need to ensure that they have a stronger voice at the global IGF and to use them to really promote more of a bottom-up and diverse, inclusive voices at the global level. I've had the pleasure of going to the Africa IGF, there's EuroDig, and I was a national IGF that I visited, and I think really strengthening that and making sure that it comes up through the system is going to be really important over the next few years, but I will stop there.
And thanks, Craig. I was about to stop you, but thanks for stopping. And thanks for all of those remarks. Next, I'm going to invite Bea from NetMission, couldn't make it, but we have Vinayak with us, who's able to speak and bring us that perspective from the Asia Pacific youth structures. So Vinayak, your 3 minutes starts now.
Thank you, Angela. I think I'm extremely fortunate to be here, and Bea sends her apologies for not being here with us today. And I have volunteered to represent what NetMission has been in the multi-stakeholder group and also as a youth member recently. So it gives me an immense pleasure that now youth has been a permanent stakeholder of the WSIS architecture. And it's been a wonderful journey towards that, and it's such a great thing to look at that we have the geographic and digital inclusion as mentioned in para 10, 12 and 24. It's so great to see there alongside the linguistic accessibility and cultural diversity too. So that's such a great thing to look at, but also that brings to me some critical gaps that we do look at, that there are some structural participation mechanisms from a youth perspective that we see that many of the regional initiatives or the youth initiatives might not get as much as funding. And also I think we have seen a lot of stakeholders who mention about funding in general. So I think that might be something to look at for sure. And of course, currently a critical gap that has been also noticed that youth not being exactly part of the innovation and technology governance sector, as mentioned in the para 81 to 83 and 85 to 87. So it would be great for the youth to be participative of AI governance and emerging technology spaces where their participation would be explicitly requested. So that would be something to look at. And of course, a dedicated investment in capacity building structure would really help us, the youth members, to be part of the global IGF ecosystem. And because of its structure, it has given such opportunities to members like me and so many across the APAC region. And of course, I think it's a great opportunity for me to be here. I hope I have done sharing some part of the youth. And yes, that was all from me. I hope I was within the time limit and yet. Thank you.
Thanks very much for stepping in for Bea. And next, we'll listen to Bruna, one of the co-chairs, Bruna Martins of Working Group Strategy, share the remarks sent by Jordan Carter from the Internet Governance and Policy Director of .au. Jordan had to go and sleep for understandable reasons. Bruna, thanks. You can share Jordan's insights with us now. Your 3 minutes starts.
Thanks, Maria. It's not Jordan here, but hopefully a time zone friendly.
Don't try to sound like a New Zealander. Okay, I don't even try. I'm a South African.
And thanks, Chris, as well, for staying so late as well. So Jordan replied to a couple of questions. He starts focusing on the broad scope of the IGF, and he believes it's necessary to provide a forum that touches on all of the subjects that are in scope for internet governance. He also highlighted that key sessions could be more focused, but this would rely on an active partnership between all the key session owners, the MAG, secretariats, the host country, and to drive a coherent and clear strategy. If done well, this could lead both to maintaining the broad scope and delivering more focused outcomes by avoiding repetitive duplication of sessions on a particular topic. That's also connected to a couple of his remarks and others as well. On the point on the evolutions of the ecosystem, Jordan shared two suggestions here. One was to ask the IGF to send a topic that it wants to be covered at the annual event and request NRIs to consider it. A MAG secretariat process could then consolidate and synthesize the inputs, which could be the basis of a main session at the IGF at the end of the year. The second suggestion he shared was to develop an opt-in recommendations documentation process trialed in one or two topics where the insights from the NRIs and the IGF on that one issue are brought together in an accessible and readable topic brief. The audience would be digital, policymakers, and internet governance community participants, And the goal of this would be to distill the insights from this global system into easy to understand bite-sized suggestions. The last remarks from Jordan are on the question regarding IGF outcomes that are influential. So he believes that some of the steps that would be for decision makers that often lack the analysis that is crafted through the crucible of genuine argument from diverse perspectives. So much advice is from a vested interest or a stakeholder with particular fixed view. Jordan added that the key benefit of the IGF is the global diverse scrutiny it can offer, and that resource of people and perspectives is not made best use of today. The working method of the IGF needs to be developed to create sessions that surface the intentions and trade-offs and interests involved, and clearly set out policy and best practice options available to drive improvements. And going to the end of it, IGF 2026 could try this approach with just one topic, and then he dives into follow-up. The follow-up is what closes the loop. The trial topic chosen should naturally link to a subsequent international or domestic policy process of importance and relevance, and the output should be conveyed to those working on the issue. And a topic suggestion he made is on age limits on social media access. And it's as a narrow, specific issue with several consequences and implications that the IGF array of stakeholders is well placed to consider. So that's it from Jordan, and thanks, Henriette.
Thanks, Bruna, and your timing was perfect. And our last speaker, and if there'll be a little bit of time, so if there's anyone in the room who hasn't spoken, we could take 2 or 3 speakers, and you'll have to be very fast, stick to 1 minute. So start putting up your hands. But our last speaker is going to be Mona Gaballa from ISOC. And Mona will be talking about governance. So I think it's very appropriate that she's our last speaker. Mona, your 3 minutes starts now.
Thank you, Henriette, and thank you, David, for the comprehensive intervention. It's great to hear a lot of the panelists are sharing a lot of perspectives, and I feel like my intervention will be really redundant coming last, but I'm happy to share ISOC's perspectives. Of course, the IGF remains a vital space for multi-stakeholder dialogue. The IGF must continue to evolve to be fit for the future, and the Internet Society sees 4 priority areas decided in the WSIS outcome resolution that require immediate action. Firstly, sustainable funding for the IGF. The IGF's reliance on voluntary contributions and host country funding has served it so far, but has created structural uncertainty year to year. With the IGF permanency, we needed further conversations on how to make the IGF financing model more sustainable, to consider what alternative or complementary mechanisms can provide more predictable and long-term financing. Secondly, on elaborating government engagement. The IGF's multi-stakeholder model only works if stakeholders are genuinely at the table. The WSIS+20 outcome resolution agrees that greater government engagement is needed, and this should include meaningful participation, especially from underrepresented regions, as well as follow-through. The Internet Society sees this as an essential element for consideration and are exploring the incentives and structural changes that can make the IGF more actionable for government engagement. Thirdly, connecting the IGF ecosystem. The IGF is more than its annual meeting with more than 180 national and regional IGFs, best practice forums, and policy networks. This ecosystem does many critical work that does not always connect to one another effectively. We need to consider carefully how this ecosystem can better be integrated so that the intersectional work and the global IGF can mutually benefit from one another while preserving its bottom-up nature. Finally, identifying the right linkages between WSIS, GDC, and other UN processes. There's a real opportunity for the IGF to build meaningful linkages with the broader UN processes, such as the Global Digital Compact and the 2030 Agenda. The IGF should be utilized to forge these connections and demonstrate its impact. We need to identify and strengthen those linkages so that the IGF is not siloed and can serve as a central node in broader digital governance ecosystems. Lastly, I'd like to just add that the Internet Society will be working with our community as well as the broader IGF community to reflect on these considerations, which will include a questionnaire that we plan to launch in a couple of weeks, and we do look forward to building on this conversation together. If you have any interest in learning more about this questionnaire, please do reach out, and I'm happy to share more information. And thank you. I do unfortunately have to drop, but I will catch up to the recording to see what others are saying. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot, Mona. We have Giacomo, Wout, and Martin, 1 minute each. Giacomo, you go first.
Thank you very much, Harriet. And I'm very pleased of this debate because I think that on the guidelines of David, we are trying to focus on the main point. I just want to underline what for me are the point on which we need to be more precise. The first is that the multi-year planning is absolutely essential, and we need to decide year by year which are the focus on which we want to concentrate our attention. But having in mind that we are a multi-stakeholder, we are the only real multi-stakeholder place. So I think that we need to decide the topics in association with the other processes going on, and trying to focus where the multi-stakeholder approach could be more benefit for the others that are working on treaties or developing UN decision and policies. And the second point is we have to use better the tools that we have as IGF, the NRIs for sure, that need to be associated to the process, as Jordan correctly mentioned before. And we need to use, for instance, the policy network. Before somebody mentioned the policy incubator, I think that the policy network are perfectly fitting for that. So it's simply to create a will and to create a contest in which this could work. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Giacomo. And Martin.
Yes, thank you. I'll make it very short. Really appreciate a lot of very good points made. I just want to emphasize that in the end, it's about the impact. It's the whole participation is a means to get to that. And I think the outcomes are twofold. One is better policies. And the other one is also capacity building by those people who participate in the process throughout the world. But in the end, it's about impact, and may it be as inclusive as possible.
Thanks, Martin. Wout.
Yes, thank you, Henriette, and hello all. I think that a lot of that has been said, but let me point to the following of the intersessional work, as I usually do. There's a lot coming out of intersessional work, the demo coalitions, policy networks, etc. How can we integrate that best into the IGF program and then into the IGF outcomes? Because otherwise it will happen just like David said at the moment. There is intersessional work, but who knows about it and how does it influence policy? And that in the end is the concept around the intersessional work, that it influences the right people. And we need to learn as IGF to integrate it, but also to then share it with the world in a meaningful way. So let me just stop there, but I think we're on the right track hearing what I've heard today. Thank you, Henriette, for the opportunity.
Thanks, Bart. And Bruna, you can have your very short intervention, and then we'll move on to the closing.
Thanks, Henriette. I just put it on the chat, but I also find it curious the lack of mentions about the possible incubation of emerging spaces like the Global Dialogue on AI and the Scientific Board, which for some could be a relevant space to bring closer or into the IGF ecosystem if possible. That's all.
Thanks very much, everyone. I think what's so clear from this discussion is that I think we have good analysis, I think we have good insights, and there's a lot of commonality. I'm not sure that we have the agency or that we understand what the mechanisms are that we can actually draw on to implement these suggestions. But to close for us, I'm really happy to have Wolfgang Kleinwachter here. Since I've known Wolfgang, which is since 2003, the preparatory process, Wolfgang has always had this ability to be very engaged in the present of what we're doing, but always to have a future-oriented perspective. And Wolfgang, what are your reflections listening to today's discussion?
Yeah, thank you, Henriette. What a great conversation. So I hope we have a good AI agent who has summarized all the proposals, that nothing got lost. There are so many good ideas, and this is really good to see that we 80, 90 participants, we are all friends of the IGF, but there are not only friends of the IGF in the world. So we have to realize that we are working in a difficult political environment where not everybody shares our future-oriented ideas. So it's nearly impossible to summarize this debate. But I want to make 3 points where I see 3 main challenges. The first one is we need really new strategic orientation. I think Anna Rachel has said it, that we should use this opportunity as a permission to reinvent ourselves. I think this is a good challenge. We have now a new starting point. David has made it clear this is an opportunity and we have to make use of this. So we have to be proactive, not to wait that somebody else will come. It's this group of the friends of the IGF who have to do this strategic orientation in an innovative way. We need innovation for policy making. And one big innovation could be that we make much more clearer for the outside world that the IGF is now, I think, the only multi-stakeholder organization in the United Nations system. So we have NGOs in the UN system, we have IGOs, but as far as my knowledge is, there is no multi-stakeholder unit in the UN system. This is the message we should bring to other intergovernmental processes. The second thing is the external factor. We have to liaise with so many new processes. So we have now a fragmented discussion landscape. And if I look to AI, if I look to cybersecurity, if I look to digital trade, we had just recently the WTO conference in Yaoundé, which adopted agreement on electronic transactions. And we have the Human Rights Council. So we have to liaise with this. So I see with a certain critical eye that in the new AI panel, there is only one member from the Internet governance community. This is Maria Ressa, the co-chair of the IGF leadership panel. So we should liaise much more with these new emerging bodies. So we are not in a competitive situation. So we should have a collaborative relationship with these new emerging bodies, in particular with the global dialogue on AI governance. In my eyes, AI governance is nothing more than a higher level of internet governance. All the elements we have in internet governance, like the multi-stakeholder approach, the sharing approach, and the holistic approach, are relevant for AI governance. So there is no need for this new community to reinvent the wheel, they can benefit from the 20 years or 25 years of discussion of internet governance if they discuss AI governance. And the final third point is we have to do our homework, the internal things. So the output document from WSIS+20 has called for a discussion on the modalities of the IGF. We have started already, and Wout has made clear part of the modalities, and the key part is the intersessional work. And because the highlight at the end of the year is the annual IGF, but much of the work is done in between, and we have to clarify how to organize this, how to make it more effective, how to have our specific discussions in the various thematic groups, best practice forum, dynamic coalitions, but how we can unite this and to produce a mainstream with a reasonable number of messages at the end of the year. It makes no sense to have 100 messages, but to concentrate and to have a strong message at the end of the year, which would summarize the international intersessional work. This would improve the modalities. This would include also to think about the composition of the leading bodies, the MAG and the leadership panel. And certainly, this has to serve the broader community, and the broader community is now constituted to a high degree by the Global South, and which should really be very open to new ideas which come from the Global South, and to strengthen the non-governmental stakeholders from the Global South so that we can really convince the rest of the world that the multi-stakeholder model is working and is to the benefit of all sides. So these are my concluding remarks, and I hope the AI agent will summarize the debate in a much better way than I have could done. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Wolfgang. I'm not sure that it's a good idea to have the bottom-up process in the hands of AI agents, but it's probably as effective as many other approaches. Thanks very much, Wolfgang. Now, next I'm going to ask the outgoing MAG chair, Carol Roach, to just close for us before we go back to our working group strategy chairs. And Carol, just thanks for being a wonderful chair. I personally hope you come back soon as the host country chair when the Bahamas is going to host the IGF one of these days. But thanks very much. And also as a member of Working Group Strategy, thanks very much for being such a supportive MAG chair. Carol, you have the floor.
Thank you. This was an excellent webinar. I think this is a good way for me to culminate my position as chair. The last 2 years has been challenging yet fulfilling. And I think we accomplished what we set out to do in terms of the GDC and becoming permanent in the IGF. I think most of the speakers touched on things that were close to my heart in terms of getting more involvement with the developing countries, the Global South SIDS. And I think there's an urgency to this. The Working Group on Strategy has put a lot of effort into their paper with regards to a way forward. And I really hope that the incoming MAG chair and the incoming MAG takes a look at this. And it has timelines, it has person's responsibility. So all they need to do is really to add the meat onto it. And I hope they really take this on. At home, we have a saying here that says, make haste, take your time. And I'd like to apply that to the IGF moving forward. We have to do things quickly. The cycle for coming is very short. You have 1 year. Then a lot of the intersessional activities have like a 3-year cycle. So we need to make haste, but take our time in getting it right. One more group, I think, of stakeholders we miss. We concentrate a lot on the youth. And the youth, as far as the UN identifies as ages 15 to 24. I think when we cut at 24, we miss a target group of the top end of the young adults, which are the 25 to 35. And these are the persons that are next in line for making policies, for making legislations within their government. So I hope we can focus on this group as well. I don't want to repeat anything that the others have said. I think that it's quite good. One thing I want to point out is value. We had quite a few persons talk about value. And in business, you have something called a value proposition. So what is the value proposition for the IGF? What's going to set us apart from the ocean of forums that we have out there? Lastly, I'd like two last things. I like the idea of the IGF help desk, especially in terms of governments. And this ties in with, so that's William, and it ties in with what Isabelle says, how do you engage the IGF? And we assume that because we have the thousands of people that attend the IGF annually, that everybody knows how to engage, but it's not true. So we need to find out who are those people that are finding it hard to engage, who are those people who don't know about the IGF. The IGF help desk, I would like to extend that especially for governments. Maybe we can have one-on-ones with governments, or maybe you have a government that is about to launch or to put their AI strategy or their AI legislation out for public consultation. Maybe the IGF with all our experts could be that place where we can be that sounding board for that agency. We have experts in the DCs, we have experts in our policy networks. We have so much access to experts, and we need to take more advantage. And I know we're running out of time, but I would like to thank everybody for attending. It's a great crowd here, great speakers, and thank you to the chairs of the Working Group on Strategy. I challenged them a lot, and they really rose to the occasion each time I threw out a challenge. So thank you very much. And one of the things that I was looking forward to over the last 2 years was that exact document that was produced, a plan that can actually be put into action. So thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your support.
Thanks. We need a plan. We also need people that will put that plan into action. And I'm going to hand back now to the MAG Working Group Strategy co-chairs. I can say that we'll do our best using AI and whatever other tools are at our disposal to produce a document that summarizes today's discussion. So thanks very much from me to all the speakers and to all the participants. And I'm going to give back to Chris, Bruna, Amrita, and Titi. And thanks very much, David.
Okay, thank you, Henriette. And thank you to you all for this rich and engaging discussion. I think this important exchange highlighted the importance of this moment for the IGF, and it confirms that the permanent mandate marks a significant achievement, but also a clear responsibility to ensure that the fund continues to evolve, adapt, and strengthen its role within the broader digital cooperation landscape. Thank you to our moderator for the excellent guidance, and also to David, Souter, and all the speakers. We will try to do a paper on this discussion and try to continue to be a platform for this kind of discussion. Thank you all, and have a good evening.